hope you're all managing in the rain. It'll be nice to look at some ceramics and think about nice toasty warm kilns as we try to stay dry and warm in these cold winter months. Well, relatively cold. California's only only a little bit cold. So I'm delighted to be back this evening to talk about ceramics. Japanese ceramics are, the ceramics of Japan are really the reason I became an art historian. I fell in love with Japanese ceramics while I was living there. So I really see them as the seed of my interest in Japanese art. The focus of the mini lecture today is a special kind of ceramics called yakishime. As Miyako just explained, the word yakishime is made up of two verbs, yaku, meaning to fire or bake, and shimeru, meaning to bind together. And together, the term refers, I'm going to share my screen, sorry, so you don't have to just be looking at me. So with the term yakishime, it means that a clay vessel is fired in a kiln at a high enough temperature, so about 1200 degrees Celsius, so that various elements like silica that make up the clay, they vitrify, they bind together, which means they become glass-like. And this results in waterproof and very durable stoneware ceramics. Now, these ceramics are not only highly functional in that they can hold water and be used for many different things, but these yakishime wares possess a particular kind of beauty that to many people is a uniquely Japanese kind of beauty. And this is because these ceramics aren't decorated with a shiny glaze or painted designs under or over the glaze. Instead, yakishime wares are unglazed. Their only decorations are the natural colors and patterns and textures that are created as a result of the firing process, and a little bit of coaxing from the ceramic artist to make them. Now, like the tea bowl that you're looking at here, this is an example of a yakishime ware. You can see that it doesn't have a shiny glazed surface. What you're seeing here is the color of the clay, and a color that has resulted from the process of firing the vessel and the various things that go on inside the kiln during the firing. Now, a decoration like this, that's a key part of yakishime, is known as its keshiki, its scenery. And that's one of the unique elements of yakishime ware. These wares don't have a painted or glazed decoration, but they have a natural scenery to them. And that's really one of the most wonderful aspects of this type of ceramic. Now, this is a map of Japan showing some of the main yakishime sites that have existed for many hundreds of years. Now, the history of yakishime, I think we can safely say, probably goes back about 1,000 years in Japan. Now, Japanese potters have been using fairly sophisticated kilns called anagama, cave kilns, that could reach high temperatures from as early as the 5th century AD. These kilns were built built upwards on sloping hillsides. And down at the bottom part of the kiln, they had a firebox, and the potters would insert wood into the bottom, and this would be where the fire was. And then at the top of the kiln, slightly raised from the bottom, was a sort of chimney, a flue, and this is where the heat and smoke would emerge from. And generally, the potters would add fuel to the bottom, and they would fire these kilns for several days so that the temperatures would rise and rise and rise, and over a few days would reach temperatures of upwards of 1,000 degrees and sometimes 1,200 degrees. And these are temperatures that are required to fire stoneware clay. Now, around the 12th century, the Japanese ceramics industry started to take off in a number of different regions, many of the regions that you see here on this map, and they're mostly around the central part of Japan. And there are major kiln sites. A lot of these are very familiar to many of you, I'm sure. There's Seto near Nagoya, and Mino came a little bit later. And the Tokoname, Echizen, Tamba, Iga, Shigaraki, and Bizen. These are often known as the 6 old kilns, and often considered 6 medieval kilns of Japan. And they were producing large numbers of stoneware ceramics on quite massive production from as early as the 12th century. And this is what they typically looked like. Most of the vessels, the ceramics produced at these different centers were functional ceramics, utilitarian ceramics of the type that were used for storing or serving or cooking food. And they would be used in homes, in temples, in palace kitchens, and in storerooms. They were not considered works of art. They were highly functional. What we're looking at here is a 15th century, so relatively recent Shigaraki ware. This is a tsubo, or a jar, and jars like these were generally used for storing rice grain to save for the following year. And also from about the 12th century onward, they were used for storing soybeans, which had recently been introduced from China as part of the vegetarian diet that came into Japan with Zen or Chan Buddhism from China. Now, around about this time, for those of you who are familiar with Chinese ceramics, the 12th century or so, the Chinese were producing a lot of beautifully glazed wares and even porcelain. So what's interesting is that even though Japan's ceramic technology was relatively sophisticated at this time, what most of these old stoneware kilns had in common was that they were producing wares that were unglazed. Not all of them, but most of them. And so these are really Japan's first yakishime wares. They were produced around about the 12th century, and they were mostly utilitarian. They were used for storing and serving, and sometimes cooking food. Now, around about over the next couple of hundred years, tea drinking started or specifically drinking of powdered matcha tea started to become common and in Zen Buddhist temples, and then spread out to the homes of the military elite during the Kamakura period, and eventually during the Muromachi period, the 14th, 15th century. The tea ceremony, a practice called the tea ceremony, began to flourish among high-ranking military leaders. They hired tea masters who would develop their aesthetic scheme in the tea ceremony, and they would match it to various vessels and decorations in the tea room. Now, many of the tea vessels that were used in the 14th century were imported from China. They were very sophisticated ceramics, often with very shiny glazes. These were considered to be the most prized wares to be used in the tea ceremony. But sometime around the 15th century, a new aesthetic was introduced into the tea ceremony, one that's very familiar to many of you, I'm sure, called wabi. And this term wabi, this aesthetic, became extremely popular in the world of tea. And it started to dictate the taste of a lot of the decoration in a tea room, but also a lot of the ceramic vessels that were used to serve tea, to store hot water, to store your powdered tea, for example. Now, this aesthetic of wabi has its roots in Zen Buddhism, but also in the Japanese native reverence for nature. And really, there's no really good word for wabi in English, but what the wabi aesthetic, it really is all about simplicity, naturalness, austerity. So a very simple, plain, natural, very organic, earthy looking aesthetic. Very little decoration and a slight look of rusticity, something that's described as wabi would belong quite comfortably on a table in a farmhouse, for example. Or at least it would look like it belonged in a farmhouse. Often these objects were very expensive. But so yakishime wares, the type of utilitarian ceramics that were being produced in a lot of these stoneware kilns like Tokoname, Bizen, Shigaraki, they started to look very attractive to the tea masters who were embracing this wabi aesthetic. They considered these very rough looking, very austere looking ceramics ideal ceramics for use in the tea ceremony. So the tea masters started to commission the potters who were making these large jars and various other utilitarian objects to create tea bowls, little tea caddies like the one you see here, and other objects, water jars, water cooling vessels, and flower vases that would have been used in the tea ceremony. So what we see here is a collection of, I believe these are all Bizen ware, objects that are very similar looking aesthetically to the earlier utilitarian wares, but they've been created in forms that would have been used from around the 15th, 16th century onwards in the tea ceremony. Now, so I said I'm going to look at two different types of yakishime ware that I particularly love. And the first one is Bizen ware. This is a type of ceramic I've loved for many years. To me, it's sort of the ultimate yakishime ware. It is sort of the epitome of this idea of firing a natural firing without glaze. And it's really one of the most highly admired types of yakishime ware. They're considered some of the most refined type of ceramics at all in Japan, even more so than porcelain by a lot of tea people, for sure. To me, the Bizen ware with their sort of flame patterns on the surface really seem to kind of celebrate the idea of how a ceramic vessel is born, born from the flames. This is actually a very small tea caddy. It would probably only be about 4 or 5 inches high. And it really originally was based on an imported Chinese tea caddy. It would have been of the type made in the 12th, 13th century in southern China. And these Chinese caddies were very famous and loved for their very glossy, brownish, black iron glazes. They were imported to Japan, used in early versions of the tea ceremony. But this Bizen example has no glaze. Instead, its surface is decorated with patterns that were caused by different effects inside the kiln. So we're going to look at a few different examples of the types of effects that are created in Bizen ware. First, what you're looking at here is the clay itself. Bizen clay is very rich in iron. It's also a clay with very highly refined particles. So it's quite a smooth clay, and Bizen vessels tend to be quite smooth to the touch, even though they're not glossy because they're not glazed. The potters of Bizen have spent almost 1,000 years really studying how the environment of the kiln affects the pots in the kiln. And they've learned how to work with the kiln to manipulate that environment to a certain degree to create the type of wares that they want to produce, to create the effects that they want to produce. Generally, the potters say that they are doing some of it, but they still, at every firing, they leave a little bit to nature. They don't know exactly how it's going to come out, but they have a general idea. Here, this is a view of inside a kiln before a firing. In a Bizen kiln, the potter here has placed several cups very strategically inside the kiln so that the ash and the air flying around inside the kiln during the firing will hit and land on these cups from particular angles, creating certain patterns on the surface of the clay. And so these are some of the tricks that the potters will use. Is they'll position pieces in certain parts of the kiln. Some parts are hotter than others. Some parts will probably be closer to the firebox, so they might receive more ash. And so with years of experience, potters know where to place pieces and what position to place them in to maximize the effects of the firing. There's a trick in the Bizen kilns to actually create beautiful patterns, like the slightly subtle patterns that we saw on the tea caddy. But there's a technique called hidasuki, which basically means flame marks. And this was probably originally discovered by accident by potters who had put straw in the kiln for some reason, or wrapped pots in straw to stabilize them in the kiln, perhaps. And so now today, but they've noticed it created beautiful designs. So they now deliberately wrap plates and vases in rice straw. And during the firing, the rice straw will burn and carbonize onto the surface, creating beautiful effects like on this amazing piece by Yamashita Joji, who's a contemporary Bizen ceramic artist. And you see here the flame, basically the straw has burnt onto the surface and has had a chemical reaction with the surface of the clay, which is very rich in iron. and has brought the iron, brought out iron onto the surface in these stunning patterns. And in this particular piece, this is in the collection of Gordon Broadfuhr, the collector in San Diego, has wonderful taste and a wonderful collection. You see he has wrapped the straw so that it's sort of the patterns of the straw, the hidaski, kind of echo the curve of this rather angular jar. It's a really exquisite example of this particular Bizen technique. Another Bizen technique, again in the collection of Gordon Broadfuhr, is this beautiful vase that is decorated with a type of natural ash. That it's the ash that flies around in the kiln that comes from the burning wood in the firebox. It flies through the kiln and it lands on the shoulders, or this I don't know how this piece was actually loaded into a kiln, but the ash will land on parts of the vessels, and then it will harden onto the surface, and it starts to take on the appearance of sesame seeds. So this particular technique is known as goma, or sesame, because the ash that falls naturally on the vessel resembles sesame seeds. And then this is another very favorite type, a technique used to decorate Bizen ware. This is called botamochi, which is a type of a sticky rice sweet. And because when dishes are loaded in kilns, or have been traditionally loaded in kilns, potters would put pads of clay in between the dishes to separate them from each other so they don't stick to each other during the firing. But it's a very specific type of refractory clay. But these pads leave marks on the surface. Again, these reddish marks that look like the pattern of sticky buns. So they're called botamochi. And these are particularly attractive. These make particularly attractive dishes. And a lot of chefs like this type of dish because they can serve their food. They basically, the color of the dish will set off the colors of the food really beautifully. Now, the next type of ceramic that I also am very fond of, the next type of yakishime, is Shigaraki ware, which is a very different type of yakishime from Bizen ware. Bizen ware is typically considered to be quite refined, even though it was one of these kilns producing medieval sort of household ceramics. But it's a much more refined, much more sort of elegant ware, I would say, and very highly admired in the tea ceremony even today. Shigaraki ware is much more kind of rough and ready. It's much chunkier. It's much sort of crunchier looking, but it's always been a favorite of mine. Shigaraki, the kilns of Shigaraki are fairly close to Kyoto, Shiga, and they were, like Bizen ware, popular utilitarian wares all the way up to the 15th century when they started to become favored in the tea ceremony, and not just jars, but also tea bowls and other tea wares were made at the Shigaraki kilns. Now, they do have a very different sort of keshiki, or scenery, to Bizen wares. They're much, they feature a fair bit of natural ash. They also the clay contains feldspar, which famously bursts out onto the surface of the clay to create a very sort of rugged appearance. I took these pictures on my last visit to Shigaraki in 2017 when I actually was preparing an exhibition of Shigaraki ware and visited a couple of kilns. This is just to show you the pine wood that is used in a Shigaraki kiln to fuel the kiln. And this is an example of an anagama. Note the little Shinto shrine at the top of the kiln. Before every firing, the potter will pray to the kami, the god of the kiln, for a good firing, not just so that his ceramics survive safely, but so that they come out looking really good. This is a wonderful shot I took through a bus window. It was raining. This shows the clay of Shigaraki, which is a very specific kind of clay. Like Bizen clay, it's a very iron-rich clay, well, not as dark as the example of Bizen clay I showed you just now, but it when it fires, it gives a very warm sort of orangey brown tone when it's fired in a kiln full of oxygen. So it has a very sort of warm look to it. As I mentioned before, it contains feldspar, these little crystals in the clay that burst out onto the vessel surface during the firing and give Shigaraki ware a very sort of uniquely rough and rugged appearance. This is another piece in the Gordon Broadfury collection. This is a tsubo, or a jar, by a contemporary artist, Sugimoto Yu. And his work, you see in his ware a few of the characteristics of Shigaraki ware. You see that sort of the rusty brown, warm reddish brown tone of the iron in the clay that's oxidized here, and does this rusty color. You can also see some of the feldspar, little sort of crystals that have burst out onto the surface of the clay during the firing. And then the final characteristic is a runny looking natural ash glaze. This is the ash that has been blown around in the kiln and has fallen onto the surface of the pot during the firing. And this gives these wares a really sort of natural, very organic look. And this is another Shigaraki ware. This is by Kyoko Koyama Kyoko-san. And she's one of the few, the rare female Shigaraki artists active in Shigaraki today. This is another vase in Gordon Broadfury's collection. A very beautiful beveled vase, a square vase. And you can again see some of the rusty red color of the oxidized iron in the clay and some of the feldspar bursting out onto the surface and some of the natural ash glaze as well. This is a particularly robust, very strong looking vase. Says a lot about the artist who made it, who is a very strong woman. Another type of Shigaraki ware that's extremely interesting is this. It's a type called a dragonfly eye glaze. And basically what this is the ash glaze that we've seen on some of the Shigaraki wares. It will fall on the surface of jars and bowls, but it can also pool in the center in a little well. If there's any sort of well in the center of a dish, for example, it can pool there and become very glassy and resemble a dragonfly's eye. And what we see here is a plate by Kuhara Yasuhiro-san. He is an artist who works in the Shigaraki style. He didn't train as a Shigaraki with a Shigaraki master, but he's self-taught, and some of his Shigaraki works are very stunning. He favors the dragonfly eye style of Shigaraki ware. And this is Koyama Yasuhisa-san, an artist who I met when I was in Shigaraki in 2017. He's very well established in Shigaraki as an artist who has helped to preserve and to promote some of Shigaraki's traditional techniques, kiln firings, but as well. But he's also been developing his own very contemporary style, which you can see here. And to me, these are contemporary Shigaraki wares that really epitomize the idea of yakishime. They are very rough looking, very elegantly made, but very rough looking in their surface texture. And they are actually built to kind of evoke the flames of the kiln. I think these may even have been called hono. I can't remember the names of the pieces. And this is him posing for me with these two extraordinary works. Very untraditional, but very much still embodying the idea of yakishime, the aesthetic of yakishime, this unglazed but really beautiful keshiki. Now I'm ending with this picture of me on the same trip to Japan. I was visiting a ceramics dealer, Robert Yellen, in Kyoto, and I couldn't help myself. I wasn't going to be able to buy this 15th century tsubo from Tamba or Tokoname, but I couldn't stop myself from picking it up and hugging it. I absolutely adore yakishime wares, so of various types. So it's always a real treat for me to see them and handle them when I'm in Japan. So I'm going to end here with a plug to you all to check out Japan Foundation's wonderful series, Doors to the Arts of Japan, which is on their website. There are about six small short videos about Yakishime, which will tell you many different aspects of this tradition, some that I had not heard about before. So it was very educational to me. There's even there's a scientist who explains why the straw turns the surface of Bizen ware into this beautiful, vibrant red color. So if you want to understand the chemistry of it, it's very, very helpful. Now, before we go into Q&A, I just wanted to end with the thought that there are other cultures who have a similar type of ceramic tradition, where they basically have very simple, very sort of earthy looking ceramics, and very plain. They're plain and natural, and they are very beautiful as well. But I think what's unique about Japan's approach and attitude to these Yakishime wares is that they've admired them and valued them so highly, and in fact, often even more highly than the finest porcelains, because of the context of the tea ceremony primarily. But so this is what, to me, makes them a very unique type of ceramic in Japan, and one that will always be very close to my heart.